thank you again for joining us today for the next installment of the Hickey Institute webinar series. Today, we'll be talking about the latest report released on the United States and all the different going-ons and trends and changes that we're seeing across credits and incentives in the U.S. And certainly, what are some of those implications for economic development, for site selection, for businesses to be aware of, and then also what are some of the different strategies that are being deployed and we're seeing in real time as some of these different dynamics shift around the country. We'll just as a few items of quick housekeeping for your convenience, everyone's been muted upon entry. Please, though, we want to make this as interactive as possible. Utilize the chat question function at any point during the webinar. There's the Q&A, and then as well as the chat. Please feel free to use either, whichever, and we'll be sure to open up the floor for Q&A at the end of the brief presentation. This is also being recorded and will be available online soon after. And just before going any further, so my name is David Hickey, Managing Director of the firm, and excited to be here today and seeing a lot of names, certainly a lot of familiar faces, a lot of friends, and then as well as for the new folks joining us, thank you for the first time on one of our webinar series. So what we're talking about today are a lot of the insights and findings from the latest report from the Hickey Institute. We'll talk about a number of different key trends and political shifts with incentives across the United States. Some of the can't go without talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and many of the impacts that that's had from a federal level, but particularly we'll talk a lot about that a number of the states and communities as well as utilities are going after, and particularly on that side, what are some of the growing influence when it comes to utilities and their important critical part in the process. Certainly as power is becoming more and more up front and center in requirements of always need a site, need great power, need workforce. Utilities certainly play a major role in that. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the different compliance standards and accountability that is increasing, and certainly to be more aware of and more focused on, not to be necessarily scared of from a business perspective or nervous about from a government or economic development official, but just understanding what that process is and what those requirements and risks might be. And then also within the report, detailed updates. We certainly won't cover all of the 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico on today's presentation, but certainly as you'll find that in the report. And also exciting that this is the 20th edition as we've been putting out this report for many, many years. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Hickey Associates, we're a family of businesses focusing on from Hickey Associates and my place on the site selection and business advisory side, but also are you familiar with Hickey Global, which really focuses on economic development consulting and doing that for nations, for states, for regions, for utilities, and communities across the country, Canada, and beyond. Hosting today is from the Hickey Institute, which is a thought leadership arm between the two entities, really focusing on, again, that business side as well as economic development and marrying that together to be able to put out key thought leadership that doesn't just focus on one of the other, but actually brings it all together. And then also the Michael P. Hickey Foundation, the founder of the business, and excited that next year will be our 40th anniversary in the industry. And so founder is a scholarship that has been set up in his name in honor that provides various scholarships for economic development professionals as they pursue additional certification, education, and the like. Excited, and for more information, please don't hesitate to reach out. So I always want to kick off these webinars with a polling question. Today's question, and one seen in similar realms as well in the past, but how often, talking about incentives, how often does the business, your partners, your clients, companies that you're trying to approach from an economic development perspective, how often do they pursue incentives and as part of the decision process? So that should be published now. If you're on your mobile device, it should pop up on the front screen. If you're on the desktop as well, it should come up within, whether you're in the desktop app or on the browser, should be up now. So already get a lot of great votes. Thank you. We'll give it another 20 seconds or so, and then we'll close it out. So again, Is it, very rarely, if never, are they part of the process? Your business, your clients, your projects coming in about a quarter at a time, half the time, three quarters, or always are incentives part of the evaluation process? And this is always a fascinating, question when we do polling, whether it's on webinars or conferences and other places, to be able to see where that's at. And, it is certainly one has evolved. We probably do a report in itself about, how this has evolved over the years from the perspective. So give it 5 more seconds. Thank you for everyone voting, and I will hold it out, publish the result right now. So as you can see, very interesting, more than half of the audience today, which is a mix of businesses and end users, tenants and occupiers, as well as economic development officials from across the country and beyond, and then as well as a number of service providers and some of our friends and peers, as well as colleagues on it. So over half, say 3/4 of the time, and then kind of a mix, and 30% actually always. Now, I would certainly say, from doing this and asking this question over the years, it has definitely moved more to that end, to that, half the time to all the time. I think it's a fascinating dynamic, and it kind of, as we continue to look, and as we'll talk about some of those different areas and why we're seeing that, certainly in times of tighter finances and capital, and that cost of capital, certainly looking for partners to leverage and bring that across. So I will pull that back down and close out the poll there, and we'll come back to the presentation. So we are certainly in a dynamic period of time, and we have a changing incentives landscape. We are seeing this across the board, and certainly much of this direction occurring with some of the different decisions and shifts in policy and direction coming from the White House and from the federal government through Congress and others. And we're looking at, in this kind of new era, one element that we had over the previous 4 years, a historic surge in funding. Many of that going directly to states, to communities, as well as to businesses, and supporting some of the landmark acts of recent years: the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure and Jobs legislation, unlike literally billions of dollars. It fueled a transition in some of our energy and environmental policy. It was a major boom and investment in the semiconductor space, as well as across infrastructure. Well, what we saw over that time and period is certainly a catalyst for investment. We saw a number of businesses, a number of new companies and direction and state policies and communities that were really reshaping the way they look at it, but ultimately reshaping the way that a lot of corporates and companies were looking at some of these different investments and direction, and driving U.S. projects, driving industry to capture much of that unprecedented support. Well, now, as we've seen in recent months and since the beginning of the year, much of that funding transition is now underway. Much of the money has been committed, already released, especially when we look at some of the CHIPS Act funding and some of the IRA and infrastructure. But numerous programs are facing cuts, elimination amid some of these different fiscal, political, and other pressures across the board. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those specifics in a little bit. But what we've now come into, and this from the federal level as well as down to the states and local communities, is only really those that are policy aligned. And I don't mean necessarily all social policies, but they certainly do come into play in certain jurisdictions and certain regions. But really looking at the high impact, looking at the ROI of projects, looking at some of the targeted industries and priorities that are there from the federal level. We'll talk about some of those shifts in a little bit, but then also down again to that local level and those that have the federal backing. And so as we've seen much of this, we're seeing the incentives, and as the poll earlier showed, 3/4, really 80% of the audience here today said it's at least 3/4 of the time, if not always, are incentives part of that. But what is being more and more critical is integrating it into a layered approach. And so we're not just looking at how much from a federal grant. We're not looking at just what is the state going to be provide, but it's looking at how can these incentive packages be layered, one from an opportunity in the sense of what can that financing and that support and that partnership deliver, but also from a risk perspective, and trying to minimize and leverage that, not just from the company perspective, but as well as from the community, from the state, from the different entities involved. And piece we'll spend time on is alignment and accountability. So really ensuring that from a government, from a community, from other leaders throughout, the priorities are being hit with measurable outcomes. And so seeing that ROI, but also from the company to be able to hit those and ensuring those compliance requirements and that those are in place. We've seen some of those compliance requirements are changing, and some of those in real time. We started seeing some of those major shifts, in fact, coming into and out of COVID, when we had some of the different office requirements and in the space, but into others on some of the social policies and some of the like that were driven. And while some of those are still in place and still driving forward, we're certainly seeing some of the shifts in some of the realms, and that is certainly not a determined area yet, as it's still in place. So when we look at it from a state and local incentive perspective, it's really a new battleground. One, facing federal program cuts across the board. When we look at it from some of the grants and programs, whether it's the IRA, CHIPS, and others, certainly that is a major aspect in dropping it. But just some of the federal funding restraints that will be there from a state perspective, and Medicaid, and some of these other social safety net programs that the states may have to ultimately pick up. What is that going to do? Where are those resources going to come from? And so we're seeing some of that volume right now as those cuts are looming and into the future, not too far off future. But what we're seeing is also some more discretionary packages. And we saw in some states, like in the state of Minnesota, with the forward funds creation and all that tied to the CHIPS Act and the CHIPS Act funding that required state and local support. Actually a true match, but some kind of match, some kind of partnership in that. Seeing some of the without chips in place, or something different, certainly being able to leverage that. And so we've seen some of these programs, such as the Forward Fund in Minnesota, that have opened up beyond necessarily some of the chips that was originally invested in. It's incredibly fierce competition. The U.S. market, from an economic development perspective, has always been competitive. It will remain competitive, continue to push for. But certainly, as we're seeing some of the new investment, we're seeing foreign direct investment, FDI, coming in, but also driving for advanced manufacturing projects, for data centers. And maybe not all communities are competing, but more and more we're seeing across. And obviously, from a local perspective, what those priorities might be. Life sciences and some of the industries in that realm, we're seeing a lot of very major pharmaceutical and life sciences announcements just in recent days. And then, as mentioned, on the FDI projects are some of the biggest prizes that are out there. And what we're seeing in some, especially in some states where perhaps the state legislature, the governor, and others have pulled back on some of the incentives, or really even maybe put more red tape to get through it. We're seeing local leaders that are being forced to or driving forward and deploying, whether it's discretionary grants, in some cases looking at land and financing structures and ways to work through different facilities and mechanisms that can drive forward, and as well as infrastructure partnerships. And that can go from roadways to bus routes to power and energy and utility capacity. And we'll talk about some of that. Because incentives, though, are also not just about money. And we're seeing this driving forward in some states and communities that may not have the ability, may not have the budget, but looking at other ways that can support. And certainly as we work with some of our clients to identify, build out workforce pipelines, looking at the future of AI, quantum, and some of these different other sectors. How do we build out those pipelines for the future and talk about those roles, not necessarily today and those skills that are needed, but into the long run and developing out? We're seeing some regions really excelling in this and seeing and beginning to win those deals now that perhaps may have looked further out a few years ago. Coordinating on the permitting side, really driving that forward. So the expedited permitting, or a number of states, communities that are working through that process right now to make sure that this can be an area that speed to business, speed to market, still being critical, and that aspect in it. And then, of course, on the utility side. So we're looking at power, we're looking at capacity and infrastructure and reliability, generation. It is certainly influencing location decisions like never before, and being part of that, and working with economic development, working with other partners from a business perspective, and vice versa to be able to meet that. We're seeing more smarter, sophisticated negotiations when it comes to incentives, and really strategically utilizing them. And I say that in a way of sometimes maximizing what that opportunity can be, really to increase as that delta is there, whether it's tax credits, grants, how they can work, but also being able to utilize them in a way that works best for the company, for the community. What is that route? Is it earlier investment, post performance, wherever that might come in, refundability, transferability versus non-refundability? Talk a little bit about that. But really that kind of being able to utilize that and doing it again in that kind of stacked and that navigating layered approach with state, local, and as well as, and more than ever before, utility stakeholders being at the table, of course, on the power and the infrastructure side, but also when it comes to incentivizing, when it comes to support and building out that overall partnership together. And then really gives an opportunity to shape the future as well. While we saw a lot of the different policies and industry targeting being driven, out of DC in recent years. We are seeing many of those, the states, also now being the policy innovator. So looking at those life sciences hubs, upskilling academies across all different types of skills and spaces. And certainly as you're seeing more investments in things like cluster strategies to help identify, where is that community? Where is our region best fit going forward? So then those ecosystems can be built out, and seeing where those communities and regions are doing, putting workforce campuses, more integrated mixed uses, innovation districts, and the like to be able to build out and leveraging what funding, what financing can be there to really help and drive business for tomorrow. Now, as mentioned earlier, accountability and compliance, and certainly something to always be aware of. And, as we look at compliance and how to that longer term strategy, once the project is set, once the company has come in, once that investment, those jobs have been hired, is really driving forward. And one of the things that's continuing to drive this in this press is that the return on investment, that ROI, is more under the microscope today than it ever has been before, and will continue in that direction. And so policymakers developing mechanisms, different areas to ensure that, is that ROI going to be in place? Putting out, which we applaud, and is a great process of standardizing the reporting process. So trying to build as much of those templates, those reports, whether it's wages, spend, it's investment, hiring, whatever those might be, to try to bring those together. Every program is going to have its own unique compliance requirements, but anywhere that can be kind of combined, consolidated, certainly to work that forward, because there are high stakes for non-compliance, callbacks, the financial side of it, reputational, even loss of future eligibility for programs today, but maybe even in tomorrow, looking at that phase 2, phase 3, the future investment, future jobs may be ineligible if the company is unable to meet it at this time. Now, when we work with economic developers and our government partners, certainly they want the projects to succeed and be successful. And so working together to really partner with service providers is something we're certainly seeing more and more of, to integrate that compliance into strategy and governance and looking forward, but also identifying when to go forward. As mentioned on the ROI, we're seeing more of the transparency initiatives across the country. We've had some of these for a long time, whether it's Kentucky, Illinois, many that have had it. Most states have some level of transparency and database today, but we're going to see more. Tennessee and others, we'll talk about some specific examples later in the discussion, but that are project level data, incentive awards, the status of those ultimately in it. And what we've found without a doubt that companies that embrace compliance really as part of their capability to protect that incentive value for the future, but also strengthen credibility and to build that out into the long run, and and being part of it. Because as we've seen in some cases and some of the research across the US, it could be as high as 73% of incentive dollars are never actually received by companies. And that's not that the company's not meeting their commitments or the government's pulling it back because of budget or financing. More often than not, almost all the time, it is because of just not having those compliance tools in place, those resources, institutional knowledge, employee transfer workers, those that lead it in the start, that are pulling out and not there. And certainly more, and we'll have a report out soon on some of the additional elements. So I want to talk about some of the key emerging trends as well. So some of that seeing and noting some of it for creative use of incentives. So states that are, again, packaging, perhaps there's areas where, financing is tight. The incentive program, it's a square peg in a round hole for some of these different projects. We're starting to see some shift of it. Talk about it in a minute. On the job side, some of the projects that we're seeing, particularly some of these FDI manufacturing projects, the size of the workforce is not as large that it may have been at one time, and with certain KPIs that are coming in. However, the investment is larger than it may be before, but with existing programs, that might be a square peg again in a round hole. And so what are some of those other areas that could be creative to be able to help support the business in the near term and in the longer term? And so we're seeing some of that with infrastructure upgrades, workforce pipelines to build those long-term ecosystems and help the confidence of the business, and not just new business, but this is core to BRE strategy on the economic development side is utilizing that and leveraging it in companies, businesses being sophisticated, proactive enough, but also on the economic development side, to think outside the box, to think creatively on how they can use some of the different resources that are there, and maybe not always a direct cash grant to the company, but what are some of those other creative uses that are in place or could be in place for the company and the business? One thing we talk about often on the value of a tax credit versus cash in that. And again, some states, some communities don't have the ability to utilize grants. And so as we look at tax credits as that aspect, the tax credits can provide great value to businesses. Unfortunately, sometimes on the refundability of that or the usability, the transferable, whatever the nature might be, can make it that much more valuable. And as you see in some of these different states, you look at in the upper Midwest, states like Wisconsin and Indiana and others that that can be refundable. They can be used in some different way or fashion. The Kansas High Performance Incentive Program, HPIP, that's commonly known, 50% of that is better than non-refundable. It can be transferred, can be saleable. It makes that much more valuable for the businesses that's going forward. It offers that additional flexibility. It does require careful structuring to understand, how that can work and that value back to ultimately to the business, to the bottom line, and to make that project successful in the near term and in the long term. Of course, one of the recent transitions and major changes in the state of Illinois with their EDGE program, as a tax credit can be very valuable for a business, but again, non-refundable. And so having to have that liability in order to use it, there's some carry forward. But now the program has multiple tiers. And if you're in that second tier, also in some different startup and other qualification from a small business perspective, instead of it being in state income tax credit, it could be utilized as a withholding tax. And I think it's withholding tax exemption, and in that can be incredibly valuable now. And when you look at some of those as well as some of these tiers, it also isn't just about job creation. To be able to earn those onto the EDGE program now in Illinois, if you retain 500 jobs, invest 100 million, that withholding tax can be back for up to 15 years. Significant change from a 10-year 50% income tax credit. And so very valuable and certainly piece. And you can read more about this, particularly in the report. We're seeing a lot of discussion about some of the tariff offsets. Now, as we talk about tariffs and certainly on not to go in a political set in either way, but it as far as we're looking at it today and some of the uncertainties that are there, but we're seeing it states and local communities that are trying to figure out ways to help, whether it's rising import costs, uncertainties in other spaces, especially to keep advanced manufacturing competitive in their regions, and also being proactive and strategic with foreign trade zones, bonded warehouses, other areas that can be in place, and how can they, from an economic development professional, be able to leverage those, put those in place. And I think we'll start to see more of this as we come into the, really here in the fourth quarter, but certainly as we start off the new year with some of that debate and some of that discussion within state legislatures across the country. Also with that, on the onshoring support side, and supplemental mechanisms and programs that can help support to target these onshoring investments to the U.S. as they are coming in. And this isn't just for foreign direct investment, foreign companies, but as well, again, on a BRE strategy, some of those domestic businesses that are onshoring and reshoring some of that investment and bringing it back to the U.S., or just instead of it going somewhere else, is placing in the U.S. And this is certainly, again, another area we saw some different pieces of legislation across the U.S. that were debated in this previous term. Some of it didn't necessarily make it across the finish line, but this will be something we'll continue to see, especially as more investments, more announcements are made across the U.S. when it comes to some of these different opportunities. And then a very critical area, and we're tracking closely, is on the incentivizing automation. And as we look at automation, and in some circles, it can be a bad word or of a negative connotation to it, but it's also can be considered an opportunity. And especially for some of those where perhaps the workforce profile, the labor requirement, some communities just couldn't pursue, some regions, even some states, because that workforce requirement was so high. Instead, we're seeing some of these coming in, these advanced manufacturing projects, food and bev, defense, life sciences, that may not require that same level. It opens up the opportunity for many more communities, states to participate or to compete for those types of projects. And so as we'll see this shifting, we're already seeing some of it, or even highlighting some of those programs that are out there that are, focused more on capital investment. Yes, some job creation, certainly job retention as part of it, but really that rewarding the capital investment and some of that coming into automation and even utilizing in some utilities, such as Great River Energy is one, and others that are looking at technology adoption that might be considered automation, but it's also energy efficiency, and it's driving back. And while some automation is going to require more power, certainly for certain sites and distribution centers and others, but also can be energy efficient as we look to the future and driving back some of those requirements when it comes to utility. And this will be a key element and key aspect that we're tracking certainly as we finish 25, 26, and 27 beyond. Now, couldn't go forward, and many of those 10 minutes that I just discussed over the last few minutes, much of that is tied to the direction that was introduced through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And as Congress is negotiating the next round of funding for the country and the budget and spending going forward, all of this is certainly paramount. And when we look at the Big Beautiful Bill, major impacts on site selection and economic development across the board. Some very critical elements, such as the new market tax credits being permanent, some expansions, extensions, and modernizations of opportunity zones. Certainly some of the major policy shifts we already mentioned earlier. Talk a little to some details of that in a few minutes. The ending of clean energy, healthcare funding, redirection, and as we talk about some of the funding, overall resources and opportunities that are there as we go forward from a state and local level, and as well as some additional reduction in funding, some of the different financial and tax implications, real estate investment, R&D as well, which could be very significant, could be very positive. Certainly hearing some of the rules continue promulgating, and we're looking at from an R&D perspective what that can drive back to the U.S. And then some of the new supply chain opportunities and some of those priority shifts. Many of you have already talked. We've held a lot of discussions and commentary on the Big Beautiful Bill and through, so I won't spend too much time on it. But certainly as we look at the clean energy side, the tax structures, some of the social net, safety net programs, and what that burden, what we're really focused on in this conversation is that burden that may come on many of the states and communities, the shifts in the federal spending priorities, and of course what this means from an overall incentives and impacting across the board. We're seeing these provisions, some of them already in effect. Certainly we're filing our taxes in April, some of the different changes, or some of the things that we had uncertainty before as it drives, but really as we look out over the coming years and some of the different spending and those budgets in the line. As mentioned earlier, major changes is something that from a business as well as economic development perspective on the opportunity zones. And now this could be a webinar in itself, but understanding what that eligibility frames are, that the powerful nature of this program to attract private investment. Now, sometimes not always necessarily job creation or major job creation, such as manufacturing and other projects, but certainly a tool throughout the country that can be utilized and has been utilized to create new investments and new hubs. Now, the new market tax credits, too often overlooked of a program. If a facility and investment is within an eligible tract, to be able to pursue it. Uncertainty has existed with this program. Through the big beautiful bill, it did make it permanent. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the new market tax credit, whether you're a business, you're an economic development professional, service provider, it is certainly one to continue to understand and to track further. It is not without its complexities and timing, but certainly can be, when looking at different capital stacks, looking at different financing mechanisms, it can be an incredibly beneficial program, and certainly, again, encourage, especially on the economic development side, to understand how some of these programs work and the nuances of it, and partners within your community and outside your community to help work through these, because they can be, again, major game changers when it comes to certain investments and projects coming across the finish line. Not going to get into an extensive discussion on the power side and clean energy programs. But we certainly saw and are going to see a significant downtake in a lot of that funding and financing, and still some of those announcements coming out of where these dollars are going to come from and where they're going to go after really some of the it's still falling from the big beautiful bill. But what is important to note is what is that impact going to be across the country? We looked at what some of the overall federal investment, not just from the IRA, but other programs, as we saw it across the country, and certainly significant in certain states, and some from the more populated states, the Texas and California and others. But looking at other states like Ohio and Illinois and Georgia, Tennessee, that are have seen major investments when it comes to clean energy, and certainly much of that and now being at significant risk. And we look at what the overall outlays were and estimates as far as that the funding over the next, say, 7-8 years through 2031, and the billions that are now in place. Now, some of these will be offset. Some of this will certainly still go forward and drive into it. But any of those that hadn't received the support yet, are certainly at risk, and where they're going forward. And what the one big beautiful bill has done, and what states and communities, as there is that, when we look at some of these different incentives, are the different regional variances that the impact's going to have. When we look at some of those targeted industries, border states, from the historic investment in ICE and immigration enforcement, border control, where we're going to see it. Now, certain regions, again, some of those border states are going to see significant investments. When we look at some of the infrastructure that's going to be required, some of the talent, some of the elements that have to be in place to support that. Defense hubs, again, a historic investment in defense, and will be across the country. Some of those very targeted investments and programs in the realm, whether it's submarines to ships to missiles and air and everything in between, we'll see that. And so certainly some of those that are anchored by military bases, by defense contractors, we'll see some of that. And I'll show a chart in just a couple minutes. And then also some of the rural areas and some of the regional areas, of additional eligibility for opportunity zones, more confidence and certainty on the new market tax credit program can certainly create areas that may not have seen that investment before going in, but it takes a required sophisticated approach and strategic approach to maximize those. Some of those that are at risk, we look at some of those clean energy, manufacturing corridors, some of those facilities that were planned, some of those that are well under their way when it looks at solar, battery, EV, hydrogen projects even, that are potentially at risk today. Some still certainly moving forward. We've seen some major EV announcements, groundbreakings that are still going, but where is that going to land ultimately over the next year, 2, 3, 4 years without these credits in place anymore? Talked earlier about some of the resources, the gaps that are going to be there from some of the social safety net cuts, and understanding how does that impact from a workforce perspective, from a resource perspective, and others as it's working forward, and perhaps unfortunately could be a risk for economic development programs and incentives. And then the tribal and remote communities as well, again, from some of those IRA, some of the infrastructure funding that will now face gaps and certainly in some ways delays. So coming back to some of those that may win or may drive forward or have opportunities, certainly on the defense, the border and immigration enforcement spending side. Again, an unprecedented historic investment across the board in these two sectors alone. And what we're going to see going forward, certainly from an economic development approach that support an overall vertical supply chain. Now, just because if you're an economic developer, you don't necessarily have a major contractor in your backyard, doesn't mean you're gonna be a loser in all this and not, because we're gonna have to see this vertical across defense and aerospace, certainly shipbuilding and others that will disperse across the country. And as we look at what as of the 2023 fiscal year, what that overall total defense spending is by state. And if anyone wants to nerd out or get as wonky as we do, really building in even by the state itself and understanding, who are those, where is this money going, where has this money gone in the past? And then certainly understanding this money to come and this funding as it goes forward, where is that going to be? Now, it's important to recognize, though, that much of this defense, aerospace and defense funding that's coming in place doesn't necessarily have a long term. This is all funding to be spent, some in the next year or two, over the next coming several years. It doesn't necessarily have in the long run. And so there's going to be some gaps. There's going to be some hurdles especially when it comes to some of the innovation, some of the R&D investment and funding that's in line, because where is that funding going to come from in the future? And some very creative math that was done through this legislative process and going forward. And again, all states, to look at it differently, all states will be impacted positively, negatively across the board from some of these different areas. But certainly as we look at it, so first from an overall state perspective, and then looking at it more on a per capita, per resident defense spending. And you can see how, some of those states, certainly incredibly reliant today. And, could that turn into a true opportunity as well from that defense space and driving forward. And want to encourage everyone to transition into some of the state and local updates. Before we into some of the strategic conversation is the chat Q&A feature. Please utilize it if you have any questions, comments for it. And then again, we'll open it up for a Q&A in just a handful of minutes here. So from a state and local update perspective, so as we look at some of those key shifts and program changes across the country, we've mentioned a number of those already. And what I'd encourage everyone to do from a true breakdown of every state, Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, is in the report. For time's sake today, to not run through all 50 plus of those, but to really talk about what are some of those trends and what we're seeing across the board. Again, as mentioned, the targeting priority industries. Some has shifted due to the federal, congressional, White House direction, but as well as we're seeing it from a state and local perspective, and certainly something that is not a new trend, but is what is best fit. And we encourage and certainly work with communities when they go outside to help identify what are those right clusters and industries and sectors and skills to be targeting for the future that's best fit for that region, for that community going into the long run. We're seeing continued investment on the site readiness side. There are a few great sites that currently sit available anywhere in the country, and really to find that that really true perfect site is virtually impossible. But we can continue to invest, not necessarily say a site certification, but really to do the process of getting those sites ready, understanding even to the basic realm. And so we're seeing investments across the country, increased incentives that are being utilized that can go down to landowners, to counties, to communities to invest in those and to help prepare for what's next and what might be coming in those opportunities. As already mentioned, on the capital investment and automation side, where we're seeing some of that shift. And I truly think in the 2026 legislative period, the state level will see some major changes when it comes to some of these different programs across the country, recognizing this drive for making sure that investment in capital, or the incentives for capital investment in automation, or the programs that exist today, can be utilized and can be leveraged in this changing environment. and some of the regional and rural incentives that we've seen across the country to help build out ecosystems and other infrastructure, site readiness, and help drive that out. And certainly, as we've had before, we do some of these different tiered structures, distressed counties, non-distressed counties, and others that help incentivize, help drive investment into those communities. That targeted skills, so not just from an industry, but targeting some of those skills as well. So we see that from life sciences, AI, quantum, other industries, advanced manufacturing, where we're seeing some of those skills, that skills change. We've been talking about it for years and years about those skills of the future. Well, it is here now. And those are driving forward, and it's a different workforce of the future, with different drivers, different realms, different amenity requests, and what that's going to do, and really making sure that there are incentives, there are structures, there are partnerships, pipelines to help build that out. Talked about some of the streamlining, application compliance side, standardizing in that place. The overall lack of federal funding is already impacting incentives across the U.S. at the state and local level, and will continue to do more so, as already mentioned. And then the policy and return on investments, those ROI debates. NIMBY is stronger than ever, louder than ever across the board. Communities, constituents, certainly to be stakeholders within their community, but in this era of social media and other areas, certainly louder and more out there than ever before. And that is certainly coming into how these programs are being used. What's the return on investment for these programs? So again, please check out the report to get a true state-by-state breakdown. But as we're looking at some of these examples, legislatures, Illinois, Pennsylvania, others that are looking at targeting strategies, targeting incentives, pairing tax credits with other sector-specific tools. We've seen it in Illinois as an example with Rev and some of quantum and others, leveraging kind of the core of their EDGE program with other industries and sectors, and creating some different carve-outs, different areas that can be worked for that space, and alongside revised approaches to make them more valuable. Workforce first, driving a number of these programs. We've seen Georgia, Maryland, Tennessee, others expanding training partnerships, the ways those programs can be used. We saw back to the state of Minnesota, increasing the overall opportunity for grants, and through one of their primary and training programs, from $400,000 to $500,000 now per grant, significant 20% increase. Utah, North Dakota, Colorado, others that have added childcare, employee ownership, and that childcare aspect and driving it. Certainly is an incentive in itself to help support through that realm, and it does also open up much more of the workforce costs and drives, and where we're seeing communities, industrial parks, and the like making those investments are certainly winning deals and driving forward. At modernizing manufacturing, looking at states like New Jersey, Ohio, Indiana that are utilizing some of their incentives firms, not always major incentives, but to help adopt robotics, going to an industry 4.0, driving that forward. Then other programs that can be utilized, like the Qualified Facilities Tax Credit in Arizona, the mentioned the HPIP in Kansas, those that can be used really to target capital investment, not necessarily always to create a significant amount of jobs, but that capital investment front. And then, as we've seen the data center conversation, continuing to refine the thresholds, we're certainly seeing some states and communities that are putting a pause, or at least a review of how they pursue data centers going forward. In states like Arkansas, Kansas, and Kentucky that have refined and built out even more of their programs. Gaining that rural regional edge, the advantage. Nebraska, from the biochar, some of the kind of next direction of energy and driving energy forward. Maine is in the resilience funding, the Dorigo incentive program, others driving, again, a capital investment, significant program as putting forward. And if anyone wants to check out a great example, their calculator on the state's website is a really neat tool, and a great tool to understand how that particular program, the Dorigo, can be utilized. And then seeing some from an overall diversification of economies, and of course, a critical part, housing, and seeing some attack financing, creative TIF work in the state of Vermont. And meanwhile, at the same time, other investments at infrastructure, ports, trade logistics. And we've seen states like Delaware and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania making investments on that. And then, as mentioned, we're in an area of accountability, driving that forward. Indiana, from a district perspective, Tennessee, new transparency on local incentives, the utilization task forward, and then public databases have continued across the country, and setting new expectations for ROI, compliance, and again, on that transparency side, and to be able to provide that forward. So as we look at many of these different areas, and how do we, from a strategic perspective, look at all these shifts and this dynamic incentive landscape, from the One Big Beautiful Bill down to the township and everyone in between, the utilities and the cross. However we look at it, location decisions are requiring more due diligence than ever have before, and really making sure that everything is going to be successful. And certainly the financial aspect is critical to it, and where incentives can be important to the overall project dynamic and drive it forward. It's a different direction than it may have been under with some of the IRA grant money in place, but being part of that decision process, along with power, tax policy, of course, people, workforce, utilities, and other elements that drive forward ultimately in the site itself. Energy costs, which, from a realm of renewables, energy efficiencies, and others that will be more difficult to get. New solutions are required, and looking at that layering perspective to be able to state, local, private financing, new market tax credits, utility tools, and others, to help build out that future, again, that creative strategy with, certainly with increased immigration enforcement, entitlement cuts, is going to create limits. The future foreign workforce we're looking at from the enforcement perspective, and we're looking at across the country. Not to get significantly into the weeds on that for this particular webinar, but we're starting to see that impact across the U.S. And with that, we need to be driving the skills, the partnerships, even some of the recruiting programs that are out there for workforce and for talent. And of course, that speed, the certainty, and infrastructure readiness it will be more important than ever, as it is today. So as we work with our clients, what are some of those questions to understand? The project models, are they up to date with the changes that are placed? Some of these projects take years to come to fruition, and through that, the various different steps, obviously major changes that we've had from COVID through to today, and does it reflect the realities of now? Does it reflect the tax changes? Can they get the competitive energy and the workforce incentives when we look at some of those costs, when we look at some of those challenges, the talent shortfalls that we're facing as well? Federal spending patterns, emerging zones, impact opportunity zones, market tax credits, and others. Continuing momentum, higher costs. Higher costs, still might be an area because the talent's there, the power's there. But what are other ways that we can help offset that and develop these partnerships? Looking at career pathways, and then as well, aligning with other partners, with service providers and the like, to help drive that forward. And as we look at it, some of the different steps from a business perspective, doing that overall policy and incentive scan, understanding what are those challenges, what are those major changes that are there, making sure up to date on the federal, but the state, local, what does the community have, and looking at that from a risk perspective when it comes to compliance of the existing incentives, as well as those changes in the future. What are some of those cost impacts driving forward, and understanding that from an overall policy portfolio perspective, revisiting constantly on that timing, the investment strategy. In some cases, we're seeing an acceleration of investments, while others are seeing a delay, and understanding, what is going to be that next realm? When is that next incentive window going to open? When is those application rounds going to come in place? As it drives forward, or when will more funding? When will that, some of the new allotments for the EDR, the economic development rate, and the rider in the state of California. How do you look at that alongside the next California Competes tax credit application round, and being able to time that out and being able to do that across the portfolio? And then ultimately, again, what is that from a market perspective, from a supply chain perspective, from an overall business decision? How does this make sense? And of course, how do you engage and work with economic developers and utilities in some of the areas where you may have challenges, you foresee challenges, or opportunities and advantages into the future? When we talk about economic development and some of the different strategies in place and what to look at, Certainly there's a new set of responsibilities as well as opportunities. And some of you that have seen myself and others on my team speak, you've certainly heard some of this as we try to reiterate, try to really make sure is out there and we're having this conversation together and continue to learn together and press. And with the federal dollars being pulled back from some of the clean tech, the green energy, and others, how can we leverage new market tax credits? How can we leverage opportunity zones and other financing? Understanding which sectors may be losing the momentum and which ones are gaining, which ones may be accelerated, especially here in the next few years. Understanding how you can fit within that. Done some great, as we've been working in the aerospace sector for decades, and understanding how does that vertical work. As mentioned earlier, it doesn't necessarily have to be in that core, but what clusters do you have? What experience do you have in different areas, and which could be maybe not be hubs today, but could be tomorrow, and leveraging, and especially when you look at your skills and that ecosystem that can exist. And with that ecosystem, what is that overall value proposition? Infrastructure, workforce, livability, risk mitigation, everything, all of that is going to matter more as we drive into it. And now, to reposition in some of that capital and when we hope we see into the pipeline over the coming months and into next year, where some of that capital infusion is going, and certainly with the interest rates and some of the changes there. So understanding, do we need to reposition target centers to stay competitive, adjusting, understanding, audit, triage that project pipeline, and how could incentives, how could funding and resources be available? We're hearing certainly at the state level, some states aren't necessarily leveraging for some of the some mid-sized projects, but really holding those grants for major projects and mega deals that come forward, while others are not necessarily chasing some of those mega deals right now. Be able to use it for other. We have had some communities that aren't necessarily as interested in industrial manufacturing. They're looking to use their incentives for retail, mixed use investments, and being able to track and whatever that priority is, to understand it, to be able to stay competitive and build those strategy, try to custom to tailor those incentives where possible, and to work with business, work with others to navigate some of the uncertainty, but also navigate the opportunities in the future ahead. And I won't get too in depth on the strategic playbook overall, and again, certainly and share some of this in the report on our side, but we look at incentives and policies, sites and infrastructure, targeting certain industries that make the most sense, doing those cluster studies and understand what's right for your community and the ecosystem that working to build, develop, make that in the future, and ultimately to understand from a talent perspective what some of those programs, that tools will have, and then as well as, of course, on a BRE strategy to be able to drive that and push that forward in the near term and long term, and engaging all together. And happy to share more of this and more details, and please don't hesitate to reach out to dig in further on the overall strategic playbook when it comes to driving forward and driving in this, again, shifting incentives landscape. Before moving on to Q&A, just wanted to give, for those of you that haven't seen some of our reports in the past, or, on this one certainly today, but the Hickey Institute's put out a lot of great content this year, and thought leadership, and just some of the audience and some of the reports that might be of interest to those of you on the call today. But, looking at regional EDO strategies, some of the impacts of immigration enforcement, what we're seeing across the country, what we're looking at and forecasting as the year continues on and into 2026. Really, again, as mentioned earlier, one of the real targeted industries we're seeing across, one of the industries that's making a lot of investments on the life sciences and med tech side. What does it take to do site selection from and to really that location strategy for the industry? Did a great report just released on incentives in Europe, government aid, and how do they vary, how do they challenge and certainly compete against U.S. incentives, as much of them, especially in recent years since the passage of the CHIPS Act, been direct, to compete, counter what some of the different programs we've had here in the U.S. And then exciting for a report to come out here very soon on risk and resiliency, and understanding some of the different areas we've seen for flooding, fires, other natural disasters, but not just on that side, looking at some of the areas of what is that impact of workforce and shortfalls, what is the impact of power and certainty and generation capacity. How do we look at that from an overall risk and resilience perspective from a business, what are those things that we need to be evaluating and looking at, but as well as from states and communities to be and develop as resilient as possible and have those tools and practices in place. And certainly hope you'll join the conversation as it's online, and these are all available either at Hickey Associates or hickeyglobal.com through the Hickey Institute. So with that, I want to open it up to Q&A, and certainly ran it up here with just a few minutes left, but we'll take any questions that you might have. First question that came in: will this be available online? Yes, the recording will be on our YouTube channel, and we will share that link out to the audience, everybody that attended and registered. And please feel free to any aspects of it or share with your colleagues and peers, and certainly also always open to having a one-on-one conversation with your team and our team to dig in deeper on any of the areas that we talked today, and as well as on the strategy specific programs and direction as we go forward. And as another question, are you seeing transparency initiatives at the local level? Yes, we're seeing in some states, Texas, Tennessee, and others, where some of these databases are tracking at the local level, and will be more and more going forward. The historical trend over the last, say 10 years has been those big primary state incentives that have been out and for in the reporting and different committees that may evaluate, audit those from time to time. But we are now starting to see that at the local level as well, to be transparent. Certainly some jurisdictions that have taken it upon themselves to have a level of transparency, but we're also seeing from a legislative approach as well on the state side. And then from another question, just real quick, what state incentive changes trends does your group anticipate during the upcoming legislative season? So I think we'll continue to see more on that compliance and ROI side, ensuring it not necessarily being more restrictive, but just having some of those different transparency and other initiatives in place. I think we'll see more on the capital investment side. So always necessarily saying automation and driving towards that, but recognizing that the KPI of the past purely of jobs doesn't necessarily always fit as we go forward. And incentivizing a project in a urban or suburban area of 50 jobs, giving that credit to 5 or 10 in a more rural, less populated region does may not be the right KPI for the future. Still encouraging getting that creative and competitive, creating those new jobs and driving it, but really again making sure that capital investment, and not just for new investments, new business, but also as a BRE strategy as well. And then as we look at what federal tax credits such as MNCC and OZ are available for companies, shipbuilding and even raw materials manufacturing. Well, exciting as we look at some of the aerospace and manufacturing side, but down to shipbuilding, major investment that's coming through, and we're looking at some rules being promulgated on some maritime zones, and certainly one that we're tracking closely from that side. And then on some of the raw and critical materials, the administration recently announced about $1 billion in potential announcements. We're waiting for some of the official NOFAs and some on the grant side, what those are going to look like, some in fashion in some ways, and some battery recycling, critical materials and others. And we hope kind of once we get past some of this funding debate and CR, whatever ultimately we come out with in the end, hopefully a return for some of that and some of the direction into it. So thank you all. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for taking the time again. Again, our report is available on, you can find it at hickeyandAssociates.com as well as hickeyglobal.com, produced by the Hickey Institute. So thank you again for all of you taking the time to join us. Please don't hesitate to reach out, to join the conversation, and happy to explore more. In the meantime, have a wonderful rest of your day, wonderful rest of the week, and enjoy the fall. Thank you, and take care.